President Trump has given Vladimir Putin yet another pass in his war of aggression in Ukraine. Why should we all have really seen this one coming? Plus, we're going to talk about the Russian world, just what happens when your part of the country gets taken over by Kremlin oligarchs. Hint, it's not great. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so we saw yesterday that President Trump said he was not pleased with Vladimir Putin, that he was mad, that at long last, after literally almost 6 months of hemming and hawing and getting run around by Vladimir Putin, Trump goes, man, I think Zelensky was right when he told me 6 months ago that Vladimir Putin was just stringing me along. And again, if he had subscribed to this channel, he would have known that even before, because as we have repeatedly talked about, Vladimir Putin, because of his KGB background, views words and public statements as being performances that are put on for the public's benefit to sort of convince them or confuse them. And actions are the only thing that matters. And Vladimir Putin's actions have never wavered once during this Trump presidency. It has been consistent escalating attacks on Ukraine, right? Since Trump has taken office, the number of drones striking Ukrainian civilian targets like Kiev and Lviv has grown exponentially. Something in some nights, it's up to 10 times the average that we saw a year ago. You also have Vladimir Putin opening up new fronts. He is now annexing parts of Sumy Oblast, an area that he has not claimed as being part of the Russian world or whatever at any point in the war. Not only that, but his demands that he's made on Ukraine for any kind of ceasefire have actually expanded and become more extreme. Admittedly, these are fairly obviously performances, and Putin's ultimate goal seems to be the military defeat of Ukraine and turning Ukraine into a vassal state. So in response to this, of course, President Trump actually was able to publicly say something that, again, we all know, that, yes, Vladimir Putin is stringing you along. He says whatever Trump wants to hear and then proceeds to bomb the hell out of Ukraine. Wow, could have told you that one. But don't worry, guys. Instead of introducing actual consequences, Trump is saying, well, let's give him another 2 months, see if he comes around before he introduces any kind of consequences or sanctions. The problem is, of course, Vladimir Putin believes that he is months away from a victory in Ukraine. He thinks that his war of attrition is going to break the back of the Ukrainians sometime soon. Now, the reality of the math is it's not clear at all that the Russian war machine is going to outlast the Ukrainians because, as we've talked about, the Ukrainians have a draft. Every able-bodied man is in the fight, or at least everyone that they can get their hands on. In contrast, Russia is relying on volunteers who need increasingly expensive bonuses to agree to sign up on and fight on what is increasingly a one-way trip. But Vladimir Putin, regardless of whether Putin's strategy is the correct one, this aligns perfectly with Putin's ultimate goal, which is to grind Ukraine down and eliminate their resistance. So Trump's saying, listen, you get another 50 days, bud. Congratulations, right? And this is awesome for him because Vladimir Putin has yet to make any concession at all of any kind, and he's faced no consequences. And what I want to point out, and again, I'm not like the biggest fan of MSNBC, but this is the best summary that I could find online of all the times President Trump has issued an ultimatum, a 2 weeks. If you don't get in line, Vladimir, I oughta. So here's an example. Remember, Trump took office in late January, 2 days after he was inaugurated. He said that if Russia failed to end the war in Ukraine quickly, the White House would have no other choice but to impose new economic sanctions. Putin ignored that threat, and no new sanctions have been rolled out. That was 7 months ago. In early March, Trump gave Putin a choice. He said, you better agree to a ceasefire or else there's going to be sanctions. And Putin said, oh, okay, good luck. And nothing happened. Then in late March, a few weeks later, Trump said he was going to totally prepared to impose economic sanctions on Russia. In keeping with this, Putin, of course, ignored the threat, and Trump failed to follow through. Now, there's a little gap here. You notice there's nothing in April. That's because April, you might recall, was Trump's Liberation Day when he announced tariffs on every country and territory, right, on Earth. He literally had a tariff rate for islands populated solely by penguins. However, there was one country that was left off of the tariff list: Vladimir Putin's Russia. So literally, what he managed to do was, instead of lifting sanctions on Russia, he put sanctions on everyone else, somehow actually improving Russia's relative trade relations. It's the same thing as lifting sanctions. Because think about it, if Russian goods are sanctioned at, let's say, 100%, and everyone else in the globe is suddenly sanctioned at 50%, well, now Russia's trading partners are going to their goods are going to look more appealing to sell. So it was actually a crafty way to lift sanctions on the Russian Federation, right? So that was in April. Then in early May, fourth time in 4 months, Trump said, quote, if the ceasefire is not respected, by the way, this was the ceasefire that was Putin falsely said was in place. I think it was like a 2 or 3 day ceasefire for infrastructure. It wasn't even clear. No one could really ever agree on what had been agreed to. And I texted soldiers on the front line and was like, hey, is this ceasefire happening? And he was like, absolutely not. Russian combat continues at full pace. So Trump said if the ceasefire is not respected, which as he was tweeting it, the ceasefire was being not respected, the U.S. and its partners will impose further sanctions. Once again, nothing happened, right? And of course, in late May, Trump said, I'm really mad. I'm so mad with Putin. And Republicans said, guys, he's ready to sanction him. He's ready to hit him. And nothing has happened, right? Putin just ramped up his military. Then again in mid-June, more attacking civilian targets. Trump said, well, maybe sanctioning Russia isn't so bad. The U.S. is losing a lot of money. For the record, guys, the Russian economy in terms of size is roughly comparable to that of Belgium. So it's not that the Russian economy is losing a lot of money. It's likely that Trump's businesses within Russia are losing a lot of money. And then, of course, here we are, Trump saying, listen, Vladimir Putin gets another 50 days to try to resolve the conflict. Now, you may know that, again, if you literally ever parented a kid, you may understand that without consequences, those kids just ignore you. And if this was a toddler and you were to say, if you don't do this time, boy, you're going to be in timeout. And then you never put them in timeout. That kid's going to go, well, timeout is just, but mom and dad, every so often when I do things, mom and dad do this and they yell, but it doesn't mean anything. It's just what they do sometimes. You can ignore it. There has to be consequences, because if there was no incentive, think about it. If there was no incentive for Putin to stop his war in June, in May, in March, in January, in April, then if there is no change to the circumstances, then why would he stop it in July? In fact, because of the sudden rug pull of Ukraine aid, Ukraine is actually in a worse spot, right? And so if in June, zero consequences, Putin said, my incentive is to continue this war, then to say, well, in mid-July, Putin's going to say, well, my enemies are weaker, right? Because they had that gap, right? It's like, it'd be like you're in a street race and the car next to you suddenly has the fuel just drop out from the car, right? It's even if the fuel gets it put back in, you're still going to have this lurch. And so given that Putin's war machine actually got to pull somewhat ahead in the race, there's no incentive for Putin to engage in a ceasefire. But what's more important, I think, is the why, right? Because ultimately, as we talk about, the words, Trump also follows the same sort of process where he says a lot of things, but his actions sort of betray his actual incentives. And here's what I want to point out is that recently he was tweeting about his relationship to Russia in the context of the Epstein files. Now, we've talked on this channel about the fact that it's fairly obvious that Trump doesn't want the Epstein files released. He doesn't want the FBI's full investigation of who these clients were, of what sort of behaviors they engaged in, who they trafficked. Obviously, there is a comical amount of evidence of his large-scale trafficking operation. But Trump says, listen, you can add the Epstein files to what he calls the scams and hoaxes perpetrated by the Democrats. Worth noting, of course, is the fact that Epstein was charged and arrested the second time under the Trump administration. So the person who created the Epstein files was, in fact, at least during Trump's presidency, his first term. But notice that he says that, yes, the Epstein files are scams and hoaxes. Right? This new scam is what this is his tweet. This new scam is what we will forever call the Jeffrey Epstein hoax. And my past supporters have bought into this BS hook, line, and sinker. They haven't learned their lesson and probably never will, even after being conned by the lunatic left for 8 long years. So FYI, first off, he's saying his supporters are idiots who have been conned by BS that haven't learned their lesson. But most importantly, he says, listen, the Epstein list is a scam and a hoax. But then he literally tells us that, guys, by the way, the Russia hoax, Russia is also a hoax. These allegations of my relationship to Russia, total hoax. And like the Epstein list, there is robust evidence, in fact, that Trump's relationship to Russia is one. Trump has a favorable and perhaps even corrupt relationship to Russia, or it has what we would consider a corrupt relationship to Russia. Why? Well, here is the Mueller report. Remember that from 8 years ago now, right? Former FBI director, Bush appointee Robert Mueller investigates Donald Trump. And officially he says, I didn't find that anyone from the Trump, I found that 30 to 40 people from the Trump campaign committed crimes of various sorts and were charged and then pardoned by Trump. But he says, Trump himself, it's not clear that there was collusion. It's not clear that there was a conspiracy. But there is the legal definition of conspiracy, which is pretty hard to prove. But he says, wait, that doesn't mean that the campaign's off the hook. Listen to this quote from the executive summary. This is on, by the way, page 5 of the report. The investigation says that the social media campaign and the GRU hacking operations coincide with a series of contacts between Trump campaign officials and individuals with ties to the Russian government. So then he says the office investigated whether these contacts reflected or resulted in the campaign conspiring or coordinating with Russian election interference activities. Although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived that it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and the Trump campaign expected that it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the campaign conspired or coordinated with the Russian government to interfere with the election. And this, I think, is the story here, is that if you know how sort of Florida real estate or any of these kind of New York real estate guys operate, they know that it's illegal to coordinate or conspire to, for example, raise rents or maintain rents at a stable level between properties. But that conspiracy doesn't have to happen, because as long as you guys are able to, I noticed that your rents are up 5%. I too am going to raise the rent on my building. But don't worry about it. I'm not. You don't even say that. You just see it online. Somebody tells you, "Hey man, I saw the building across the street raise the rents 5%." You go, "Huh, interesting. Well, I guess that's a new market rate. Sounds like we should raise our rents 5% too." Right? And when that happens across, again, that's the sort of favor system that is so common in business, right? Look at, for example, airlines. Do you ever notice that so many of the flights that you and I take, right? There's only one airline that flies from city A to city B. You would think in a free market that if you thought you could run it cheaper, that you would just do that flight, or you would just operate that flight just to carve out half of that traffic, right? And no one's ever charged the airlines with conspiring to divvy up key U.S. airline routes. There's just an incentive, because if you don't have to compete, you can charge whatever you want, and they just sort of divvy up those key routes. So this is the point: is that Donald Trump he never needed to coordinate. Just like now, he's not necessarily coordinating with Vladimir Putin. He understands what Vladimir Putin needs, and he helps him out. Just like Vladimir Putin has understood what Trump needs and has helped him out. That is how this works. But don't worry, guys. Don't worry about that, because the president continues his campaign of absolute wins. That's right, by switching corn syrup and Coke to real cane sugar, guys. Don't ask me why this required presidential intervention. Don't even ask me why this is important. But the key takeaway is that you don't have to worry about whether President Trump was involved in kidnapping and exploiting children on an almost industrial scale, nor do you have to worry about the fact that he seems to be aiding and abetting America's enemies, by the way. Worth noting, of course, the Russian state policy is expressly the elimination and of the West, Western hegemony, and replacing it with, of course, a Russian hegemony. And maybe you think to yourself, well, you know, I watch a lot of Western men bad YouTube videos. Maybe it wouldn't be so bad to be under Russian hegemony. Well, we're going to talk about that. But before we mention that, I want to mention that, of course, it is Thursday, and that means that we are dropping another video on combatvetnews.com. I just got, literally last night, I was up with my 4-week-old, as I am every single night, and I got a text from one of my contacts in Ukraine with a bunch of videos of more of their drone operations. And supposedly they've got even crazier drone footage for us. So we're going to be taking a look at that. That's not available anywhere else, totally uncensored. And it's only for members that want to support me, enable me to continue to say these things, because obviously, as you can imagine, it's not great. Sponsors aren't exactly beating down my door to hear me criticize the administration, right? This administration, even more than the last one, will really punish you for supporting their critics. So anyway, you guys, I know Americans aren't intimidated, not by thugs, not by assholes, and certainly not by Vladimir Putin. So if you want to support me, keep me able to do this every day and get access to literally hundreds of uncensored combat videos going back to the start of the war, help me out. combatvetnews.com. Become a member. The link is in the description. All right. So what's it like to be in the Russian world? Well, again, we've talked about the fact that for Vladimir Putin, he is not a democratically elected leader. But that doesn't mean he doesn't need a certain level of popular support to maintain his war machine, right? As long as he has around a third to a quarter of Russians who are diehard supporters who believe he is standing up for Russian identity, for the superiority of the Russian ethnic group or whatever it is, as long as he's got them backing him, he will be able to sustain this, right? He also, of course, needs the support not of all Russians, but of a key class of oligarchs, right? Just like every other king in the past, right? It doesn't matter what the peasants thought about their medieval king, but it really mattered to that king what his vassals, his knights, his counts thought about him. Because if 51% of them decided that they were tired of this and tired of his antics, they would simply find themselves a new king. So that means that the harder life gets for Russians, and particularly wealthier Russians, the harder time Putin's going to have sustaining this war. Now, in one example, we see Russia has recently said, we're going to start fining users who search for banned content, including if those that use VPNs. Now, they're going to be fined for accessing what they call extremist content online. But this, as we know, extremist content in Russia can be very, very innocuous. It can include anyone who accesses opposition Russian media like MediaZona or Moscow Times, any independent investigations, even social media platforms that might contain information that Russia doesn't like. So to my Russian viewers, I don't know, man, get a better VPN. I don't know what to tell you, right? And extremist materials aren't just books, music, or websites that are officially banned by the Justice Ministry, but also content seen as encouraging protest, critical of the government, or supporting the political opposition, right? And these fines, of course, are a lot, right? Up to $900 for individuals and up to, I think that's about $4,000 for companies. That's a lot of money That's a lot of money for the average Russian. That's, I think, almost like a year's salary. I think that's like like 3 months salary, 2 or 3 months salary, depending on where you are in the country, right? In fact, even just intentionally searching for materials the government deems extremist could result in a fine of $35 to $60. And what's fascinating is that the fines currently apply to VPN developers or providers Oh, yeah. And you're not even allowed to get a VPN like tool. So if you have a VPN on your phone, that alone might be enough to trigger a deeper check. So again, you can already see your internet freedom getting ground down by the Russians. But at least you can still take a shower, right? Nope, JK. Because, of course, guys, there is a huge, what they see as mismanagement and corruption resulting in water shortages in occupied Ukraine. And the reason, as they talk about, is because it's because of corruption. Because remember, this regime, the way a regime like this functions, as we just talked about, that the support base is not the voting public, because the voting public, well, they're not voters. They don't vote. It's an autocracy. So the public's opinion only trivially matters. What really matters is the opinion and thoughts of the oligarch class. Well, what is the oligarch class? If you are a Russian billionaire or multimillionaire or well-connected politician in charge of, let's say, a security apparatus, what do you want? Money. And so what does that mean? That means that you have to find a way to take money, tax revenue essentially, from the state and put it in the pockets of oligarchs. And then you have to let them continually bring that money in. The problem is, of course, if you're an oligarch, right, by definition, you're pretty greedy. So what that means is that in Russia, all these public utilities, state companies, it's expected that a significant portion of their budget ends up lining the personal pockets of key political and business figures. And that's no different than who's in charge of occupied Ukraine. So here is citizens in occupied Mariupol getting water from a water truck, which you may ask yourself, well, where's the pipes, right? And the answer is, of course, that, it's what should have been spent rebuilding water treatment plants is instead lining the pockets of oligarchs, right? Particularly those, and we've seen this, right? Even Russian generals oftentimes end up having side businesses as contractors in these occupied regions. And these are areas, but this is particularly acute in the occupied territories because in a lot of cases, the occupied regions were supplied by areas that remain in Ukrainian hands. And so obviously the Ukrainians are not going to, or physically cannot, provide water to the occupied regions. And of course, this has been something that's been going on for a long time. But again, we're talking about 3+ years that Russia has had to fix this water issue. And the fact they haven't is because, again, of corruption and mismanagement, right? But at least Russia's focusing on its military. Surely its military is the most successful institution in the Russian government. Well, it depends on your seat. Because, well, you can see that Russia, according to some recently leaked documents, Russia's 41st Army has experienced losses that are very, very uncomfortable, even by Russian standards. We talked yesterday about an American dad who got bamboozled, tricked by Russian propaganda to come move to Russia. And then he got tricked further to sign up for the Russian military, where he's about to get sent to the front lines, likely never to return. But what's interesting is that according to documents that were provided by defectors to the Ukrainian army, Russia's 41st Combined Arms Army, which is, of course, 4 motor infantry brigades, soldiers drawn from Siberia and southern Russia, that had sustained 8,625 KIAs, with another 10,000 MIA, and here's crazy, 8,000 deserted. That means that the confirmed dead and the deserted are almost equal, which is insane. And this is, of course, the army fighting near Pokrovsk, right? Which is probably should be considered the main effort of the Russian military. But this is absolutely just an insane level of loss. I'm trying to see if I can get, so this is the total since September 2022. But what would be fascinating, and I'm not really sure how big a Russian army is, but this seems like their losses are likely the size of the entire army or close to it. Oh, here we go. It says at least one brigade literally has had 200% losses. The brigade was originally 3,500 troops, and so they have lost basically 2,500 killed, 3,000 missing, and 3,000 deserted. So that means that essentially the brigade was exterminated to the last man, reconstituted, exterminated to the last man, and reconstituted, and has nearly been exterminated to the last man a third time. This is insane, right? And this repeats itself for several brigades. Here's the 35th Brigade, which says that they have had, again, 3,500 people, 2,000 killed, 3,100 missing, and 2,200 desertions. So again, nearly 2 full wipeouts and a half. This is the kind of, this is what Russia feels it has to do to make these gains. But what's worth noting, and it's sort of insane to me, is that every one of those people has a family, right? And it's one thing for a family to say, oh, my loved one was killed in defense of the country to defend it from invaders in a noble sacrifice. And also, Ukrainian casualties do not look like this, by the way. Their units are not conducting this level of offensive operations. You are not seeing their units wiped out at this scale. The Ukrainian military is smaller, but they do not engage in these one-way assaults. And so what you have is you're producing on an industrial scale families who have experienced tremendous loss and are basically comforted by the fact that they should be getting a massive, massive payout. But of course, as we've talked about on this channel numerous times, the Russian government is extremely stingy in terms of its payouts. Every time and in every occasion it can, it tries to avoid paying this out. That's part of the reason there's so many missing in action, because missing in action allows the Russians to avoid paying out death benefits. But let's be honest, if you send someone on an assault to a Ukrainian position and no one from that unit returns, they're probably not out getting barbecue. They more likely are the barbecue. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thank you to James J21, Yanko Georgiev, Chris Gorsuch, Paul Templeton, Cytronic, Steve Moran, TR Nita, Alan Nuts, and CM Holmes. All of our Lieutenant tier members. Could not do it without you guys. Appreciate you all so much, and I will catch you over on Combat Vet News for the next one. Cheers.